Today on the Maintenance Mindset, we're going to talk about a resident that, by the way that she conducted herself, I was driven to actually learn everything I could about stoves and ovens. We're going to talk about the lessons that I learned and how we can apply them at our properties right after this.
AppWork is one of our founding sponsors. Much more than maintenance, AppWork is advanced business intelligence. Streamline maintenance workflows and keep an eye on the leaderboard as your service teams enjoy the gamification of maintenance. Visit appworkco.com and transform your productivity today.
I got a service request one day from a resident, and I happened to notice that the name on the work order was not listed, which for this property, it was a little bit of a weird occurrence because the office team was very cordial and very conversational. And there was enough information in the service request to indicate that a conversation had occurred. So when I went to the apartment, I met Miss Evelyn. Although the very first time I met her, she didn't tell me to call her that. I said, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, the normal way that I was raised to address persons that I don't know their names. And I said, hi, I'm Paul. And ma'am, apparently your stove is broken. And she looked back at me and she says, I'm not ma'am. Call me bitch. Now, I was very taken aback because that's not exactly a descriptor I would use. And yet, this very interesting lady was standing in front of me, earnestly looking eyeball to eyeball, and she told me to call her that. And I said, ma'am, I don't think I am, but I'm here to look at your stove. And she looked at me and she says, yeah, it's broken. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Let's go take a look at it. So we go into the kitchen, and immediately as we get to the kitchen, she holds up her hands and she says, do you see these? And her hands, it was very, very obvious, were full of arthritis. I mean, her fingers, like if you're looking at video, you can see my fingers come directly off of the end of my palms. In her case, they were at a sharp angle away from her thumbs. And I said, yes, ma'am. And she says, I have to bake bread. I bake bread every day. And come to find out, through talking with her over time, it was a prescription for her. Her arthritis was very bad, and it was along, and I mean the knuckles on her hand, and it looked to be painful. But she had found that the process of baking bread, kneading the dough and mixing it and making bread helped. She baked a loaf of bread every single day. Now, Miss Evelyn was not exactly a large woman. She didn't eat the bread that she was baking, but she baked bread regularly. She had just moved in, and after showing me her hands, she showed me on the cutting board what looked to be a very, very large lump of charcoal. And it smelled burnt. That's the best way I could describe it. She looked at me and she says, listen here, son. I need to bake bread. And if you don't fix this oven right now, we're going to have a problem. I said, yes, ma'am. Let me take a look and see what I can do. So she left the kitchen area and went into the living room, and I opened up the oven and pulled out the drawer from underneath. It was an electric stove, so the drawer underneath was a storage drawer, and I pulled it out and looked around, and I didn't see anything that was obviously a problem. I pulled the stove out from the wall and very carefully took the back panel off and began looking and testing. And I didn't find anything that was a problem. And it was at that moment that I began to realize that I might have a pretty big issue here, because Miss Evelyn is obviously upset. And not only that, Miss Evelyn has a very strong personality. I went back into the living room and I said, Miss Evelyn, I'm going to have to do some research in order to figure out what's going on, because it's not exactly obvious. And she looked at me and she says, look, son, there's a reason why I told you to call me bitch. I want things that are done right. If you get it fixed to where it's done right, we won't have a problem. If you don't, we're going to have a big problem. I said, yes, ma'am. I will be back as quickly as I can. And I left. I went into the office and began making phone calls. You see, this is before the time that we had a huge internet library and all the resources that we have today. Instead, I had phone numbers. I mean, during this part of my career, I had a pager. So I know those of you who are younger and aren't aware of the way things were when we were on call, this is that time period. This actually would have been in about 1996, something like that. So I began making phone calls. I called an appliance vendor. I called a salesman friend of mine of a supply house at the time, and he gave me the phone number for GE service, because it was a GE stove. And I called and I talked to the GE service technician representative, and he walked me through what I needed to do in order to fix the problem. And really, that's the whole reason why we're beginning to talk about appliances. You see, appliances are a topic that for our residents can be challenging. They can be challenging for a number of reasons, no less than the fact that often when residents come to live at our communities, they're used to the appliance that they were using before. In Miss Evelyn's case, she was used to the last oven that she used at the property where she lived prior to moving into where I happened to be the maintenance technician. And the new oven didn't work the way that her old one did. Now, as we'll find out when we continue the story, that implies that the last one worked correctly. And in this case, it did. And in this case, the new oven where she was living now didn't work correctly. At the time, I didn't know how to determine what the correct pathway was. But before we get to that, the reason I bring that up is maintenance professionals or leaders of maintenance professionals. Do you know how your range or stove is supposed to be working? For instance, if you have an electric stove and you take the knob on that electric stove and you turn it or adjust it to a setting, on the electric stovetop, either the 6-inch or 8-inch burner, as is typical, you adjust it from low, medium, or high. My question to you is, what actually are you adjusting? Are you adjusting the temperature? In other words, if you set it to low, does the temperature of the burner stay below a certain amount? Or if you adjust it to medium high, does it go to a certain quantity of degrees Fahrenheit? The answer is actually no. On an electric stove, the stovetop, You're not controlling the temperature at all. As a matter of fact, the infinite switch, the switch that is connected to the back side of that knob, it doesn't control or adjust temperature. It adjusts duration. Meaning, if you take that knob and you turn it to high, what you're getting is a completed 240 volt circuit running through either that 6 or 8-inch burner all the time. It is constant power. If you take that knob, the same exact knob for the burner, and you crank it down to low, what the infinite switch does is it closes the circuit for a short quantity of time and then opens the circuit for a larger quantity of time. In other words, if you took your voltmeter and you pulled the burner out and you plugged the prongs of your uh, uh, multimeter in to that outlet, what essentially you would be measuring is when you turn it to low, you would see 240 volts on your voltmeter. And then for a much, much longer period of time, you would see 0 volts. Then you would see 240 volts for a short period of time and 0 volts. Turn that knob to medium. You would identify and see 240 volts for the same quantity of time that you would see 0 volts. If you adjust the knob to medium high, you would see 240 volts for a longer period of time and then a short period of time where there's 0 volts. In other words, on an electric stove, what you're actually adjusting is the quantity of time that the burner is heating. This is why, if you are cooking on an electric stove and you're trying to simmer something without burning it, then you'll notice that in order to maintain the same temperature in the pan, you'll keep turning down the burner. I mean, you'll even boil water on low temperature eventually, because there is carryover temperature depending on which kind of pot that you're using. Now, before this turns into a recipe sharing contest or I begin talking like this is Food Network, as a maintenance professional, we've identified one of the biggest causes for work orders, and that large cause is our residents. Many of our residents, and I would, if I were a betting man, I'd be willing to put money down. Many of you listening to this right now weren't aware that a burner knob on an electric stove doesn't control temperature. It doesn't. That is a fundamental challenge for us because we have residents moving in. Those residents come, they get there, they move all their stuff in, and we provide them with the appliances that they will use throughout their tenure at our community. We might leave behind instructions in the proper use of those appliances. But even if we leave it behind, how many of our residents actually read those instructions? If they did, the operational manual tells you exactly the way that electric stove works. Chances are they don't read them in the same way that very few of us have actually read them. I saw a survey a while back, and I wish I could remember where I got that from, the survey from, but it was talking about younger generations than myself and how they are not cooking as much as my generation is. Well, that has led to and the popularity of all of the food delivery services. And what that means is that the appliances we're using Instead of creating new dishes from scratch, they're being used to reheat. Many of our residents, particularly our younger generation residents, they are reheating things in either the microwave or the stovetop. And without the understanding of how that stovetop works, they end up burning things. And without the fundamental knowledge on how it works, to our resident that's not familiar with the stove, it's broken because it burned the food instead of reheating it. That might be an interesting amenity for a management company to offer as cooking classes or tutoring of cooking. I don't know how that would work, but hey, it's an idea. Now, that's an electric stove. What about a gas stove? A gas stove, one of the most common misunderstandings is truly about cleanliness. I guess that could be said for both electric and gas stovetops, but particularly for a gas stovetop. When we turn on a gas stovetop, an easy way to identify if that stovetop is going to work correctly is to look at the burner as you turn it on. Unlike an electric stove, a gas stove is controlling the flow of gas through a valve to come out the burner eye. That means that you are having direct control of the quantity of gas coming out the little orifices around the burner. Yes, that does mean that on a gas stove, unlike the electric one, you are controlling temperature. But it also means that if the little orifici, the little itty bitty holes that are going around that burner, if they're clogged, then you're not going to have even heat. As a matter of fact, I have seen some inexpensive pans that have actually gotten a hole burned through them when some clogged orifices around the outside of that burner caused a one heated area of the pan to get hotter than the other, and it actually burned a hole through the pan. That's not a good thing. But what that does mean for our residents is that they have to clean up any spills, grease, oil, food, anything that falls on that burner. If it clogs those little itty bitty holes, the ports that go around the outside, then the stove will not perform as it was designed to do. Now, cleaning the surface, that's actually pretty easy. It can be done using whatever sponge or a brush. Some stoves actually allow a resident to easily remove that burner, just unplug it, because it doesn't plug in hard. By plug, there's just a couple of little slots and tabs that fit down in. And when they can be taken out and removed, some stoves actually allow residents to put the entire burner into the dishwasher. Matter of fact, if you have a gas stove, when the apartment's vacant and you're not doing this, go ahead, take all the burners, everything off the stove, and run them in the dishwasher. That way, one, you're testing the dishwasher while the apartment's vacant, and two, when you get finished, the burners are all cleaned because the grease has been removed from the burners. In the case of our residents, though, if we go and identify that the orifice is clogged, one or more of the orifice, be very aware of what you use to clean out the inside of the holes. Yes, the surface of the burner, you can wash that off, wipe that down with a brush or a sponge or all the other various cleaning tools or devices. But the individual orifice, that will require something to clean the little itty bitty hole out. Do not use an acetylene torch tip cleaner. I have seen maintenance technicians attempt to use this and clean out the orifice. Each of those orifices, they are a specific size. Do not clean them using a acetylene torch tip cleaning tool. The reason why is that acetylene torch tip cleaner is abrasive. And when you find the correct size that fits the inside of the hole, you will damage the orifice. That's not what it was designed to be used for. Instead, on a gas stove, the best way to clean those individual little orifices around the burner is either a toothpick or a safety pin. A safety pin is small enough that it'll stick through without damaging the hole itself. And the nice thing is, if you go into vacant apartments, often you'll find them for free around the edges where our previous resident wasn't able to vacuum. So it's a very inexpensive tool to use. But those are stovetops. Those are the most common things that are found, or problems that are found with a stovetop. After this short break, we'll come back and rejoin Miss Evelyn, because I refuse to call her by the name she told me to call her by. We'll be right back.
Our sponsor today is AppWork. Best known for exceptional maintenance workflow management, AppWork offers so much more. Optimize operations with its advanced business intelligence that turns data into strategy. Simplify your operations with AppWork's intuitive platform. Service team members love the gamification of maintenance workflows and leaderboards, making everyday tasks a competition for number one. From project management to team communication, AppWork has you covered. Visit appworkco.com today.
So let's talk about the oven then. Now, these discussions about the oven work for both electric and gas, because the operation of the oven really truly comes down to one thing: heat. I mean, that's what we're doing, right? We put food inside the oven and we apply heat to it. But it gets a little bit more involved than that, because we have to discuss the source of that heat. So my question to you: where does the heat come from that cooks the food in an oven? I know chances are your answer when I asked that was almost immediate. Well, it comes from the burner. Actually, that's not quite right. If the heat that cooks the food in the oven comes from the burner, then why are we using an oven? I mean, we've got the stovetop, what we were just talking about, in an electric stove, old style, where you've got the little spiral burner on top, or new style electric oven with a glass top on it. Both of those operate the same, or even a gas stovetop. Yes, whether the heat is being applied by a gas burner or an electric burner, physically, where is that found? If we put food on top of it, the burner is found underneath. In that case, heat is being applied to the food when we put it on top from one direction, from underneath up. If inside of an oven we have the same situation going, why are we using an oven? The true answer to the question of where does heat come from that cooks food inside of an oven is the box. You see, yes, the burner in an oven during a normal bake cycle is found on the bottom of the oven. Whether it's gas or electric, both of them are made that same way. But that burner is not designed to heat the food. It's made to heat the box. The box radiates energy from the floor, the ceiling, the walls, the back, the door, 360 degrees all the way around, degrees of angle, not degrees of temperature. It's designed to shoot that energy from the walls equally to all the sides of the food that you place in the middle of the oven. Because most of our dishes or pots or pans are round or rounded, or they're not perfectly square, or even when they are perfectly square, you have corners. When we read the instruction of what we're supposed to be baking, often it tells us we need to spin or turn that food 90 degrees, 1/4 of a turn. And what that does is changes the hot spots and the cool spots inside our oven, because there will be some. The fundamental understanding of an oven is that the box cooks the food. That also means that the box has to be clean. Before any service can occur to an oven, it has to be cleaned. Now, how are we going to clean the oven? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can end up doing that, because if we don't remove the debris, it's going to give you exaggerated cold spots, which those cold spots will create a greater degree of difference between two areas side to side in whatever it is that you're baking. So clean your oven. Oh, by the way, if your answer to how are we going to clean the oven is to use an oven cleaner, be very careful, because not all ovens are safe to use oven cleaner in. Now, oven cleaner, which has multiple brands, a lot of them are synonyms of simple, and off is the antonym of on. So you can come up with those brand names, but be very aware that if your oven has an extra handle or an extra button on it that says self-cleaning oven, do not use standard oven cleaner in it, because a self-cleaning oven is not made to have oven cleaner used in it. Oven cleaner as a chemical is very caustic. It is, depending on the brand or the make or whatever it's made up of, it could be acidic. I've actually seen oven cleaner that burns through flooring. So use with care. It's always good. The number one rule with all chemicals is follow the instructions that are printed on the container. If you have a self-cleaning oven, the thing to realize about a self-cleaning oven is that inside that oven, you have a substance on it called a pyrolytic coating. Yeah, I had to write that down in order to make sure that I kept track of it. That pyrolytic coating is a solid. When we view it, when we look at it, it looks kind of nice and shiny on the inside of the box. But that coating actually turns to liquid at a high temperature. That temperature could be between 700 and 950 degrees Fahrenheit. This is why, in order to initiate a self-clean cycle, following the manufacturer instructions, you first remove everything that wasn't designed to be used inside the oven. This means if your resident has a pizza stone or some other baking stone inside the oven, it's all got to be removed before you use a self-cleaning cycle, the self-cleaning cycle. When you trigger a self-cleaning cycle, you close the door, you push self-clean, and then there will be an extra step to trigger the self-clean. And that extra step either a button, or I've seen some that actually require two buttons to be pressed, or there's a handle that you pull all the way across. But that extra step will lock the door of the oven, and that door's not coming open until the full self-clean cycle is finished. Because due to that pyrolytic coating, the inside of the oven is going to get upwards of 1,000 degrees. What happens is the inside of that oven heats up, and that pyrolytic coating liquefies, releasing any food that is spattered or is now stuck to the sides of the walls of that box. That means that that food will fall off, and because it's so hot, it turns to ash. Because it turns to ash, when the cycle is finished, the only thing you have to do is take a wet dish rag or sponge or damp cloth and wipe out the ash, and your oven is completely clean. This is also the caution. See, the self-cleaning cycle, you have to be aware of what's about to happen. I remember one Thanksgiving, I was on call, and I got a call from a resident at 1 o'clock in the afternoon that was sobbing in angry tears, mad at me, blaming me and my property for ruining her first Thanksgiving as a newlywed. She and her husband were having her in-laws over, and she woke up that morning and decided she wanted to put Tom Turkey into the oven for dinner that afternoon. The only problem was is she decided that the oven should be cleaned before, so she triggered a self-clean cycle at 8 a.m. Well, the self-clean cycle can take 6 to 12 hours, depending on which kind you have, which kind of oven you have and you're using. And by the time I got there, her husband had the stove pulled away from the wall and was using a pry bar to try and get the door open. Had unplugged the oven. Well, the thing is, that door is not coming open until the temperature drops back below 200, 250 degrees. This is done for safety, because if that oven door was to open when it's 1,000, upwards of the 1,000 degrees, it would burn you instantly. It's a fire hazard. So what this means is, know how to use your oven. This is a good class for both our maintenance team and our office team to know or be aware of, because that cleanliness piece is actually where we begin, back with our story of Miss Evelyn. After talking with the GE service department, I went back to Miss Evelyn's apartment and we began talking, and it was really neat. I got to know Miss Evelyn a little bit. See, she had lived a interesting life. She actually worked for a real estate company here in the greater Atlanta area, and there's actually a street named for her in Marietta, Evelyn Street. And she was a really neat lady. She worked for the developer, the owner of the developer of that area at the time, and she had lived through a lot. And over the course of her residency, I got to know her more and more. And no, I never called her what she told me to call her. Now, we'll revisit that after we finish the story. You see, I went to her apartment, and that was when I began to discuss with her the need to calibrate her oven. We began talking with, and as someone who baked as much as she did, she got the answer to that question instantly of where does the heat come from to cook the food? The box. She knew that. And we got to talking about it, and after having a couple of jokes, I asked her, what is the most common temperature that you use to bake your bread? And she says, well, uh, between 350 and 400 degrees, depending on the recipe. Okay, great. Then we need to be sure that the oven is cooking at that temperature. That was the second thing that GE pointed out to me when I was on the phone with them. And that is when you set the burner knob, both on an electric oven or a gas oven, you're not setting the exact temperature that the oven is going to maintain completely. Actually, you're setting the average temperature of, and this word is important, we'll come right back to it, a preheated oven to maintain. Now, there's a couple of things to unpack there. First is that if you set your oven, or Miss Evelyn sets her oven to 350 degrees, the temperature inside that oven doesn't rise up to 350 degrees and just stay put. Actually, it goes above 350 degrees and then coasts down to below 350 degrees and then pops up above 350 degrees and coasts down below 350 degrees. As a matter of fact, the more expensive the oven, the better the quality the oven, the narrower that band gets between the highest temperature and the lowest temperature. You can get some of those chefs or professional quality cookware found in like the high-end restaurants and people who have the really expensive cooking equipment. It will maintain the 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 true temperature will maintain within a 5-degree range. In other words, 2 degrees above the set point and 2 degrees below the set point. Those are the really nice stoves, the commercial grade, the big name. Chances are you're familiar with those names, and they're fairly rare in the multifamily industry, and that's fine. Because in this case, we're dealing with standard homeowner grade, Hot Point or GE in the case of Miss Evelyn, or Frigidaire, Whirlpool, all of those that are just standard homeowner. And they work just fine as long as they're working correctly. You see, what that means is when a oven is working correctly, it will be within 10 degrees of set point. Meaning, if you set it to be 350 degrees, it will be within the average temperature will be between 350 up to 360 and down to 340. If it is not, you adjust it. In some stoves, you actually take the knob off, turn the knob around backwards, and on the back of the knob, you'll see the adjustment there. Newer stoves that don't have the knob, you've got the push buttons, follow the manufacturer instructions, and it'll show you how to get into calibration mode. But actually, that's not the punchline. The punchline is you need to determine what that average temperature is inside the oven in order to know what to calibrate it to. But here's where we go back to that original thing that I said we needed to unpack. And that unpacking part is preheating. If our box cooks our food, that means that the box itself has to be preheated to near the temperature that we're expecting to maintain. If you don't believe me, look at any and every box of brownies or cake mix that you find on your local grocery store. The very first instruction you're going to see is preheat oven to a given temperature. I mean, even if you get the little biscuits or the cinnamon rolls that come in the little tube, you know the tube I'm talking about. You peel the paper off the outside and then knock it against the countertop, or use a back of a spoon or your thumb and it pops open. When you read those instructions, the very first thing it says is to preheat the oven. By the way, if you have a resident that's calling in for their oven being broken and the bottom of whatever food is burnt, but the top is still raw, that's an indication that the resident did not preheat the oven, because they're actually cooking the food with the burner, not the box. Okay, so preheat the oven. How long does it take to preheat the oven? Depends on your stove. By the way, for those of you who do like to cook your turkey, do it in a clean stove. And if you're going to use self-clean, use self-clean a couple of days before. By the way, that resident that had used the self-clean that was prying the oven door open, yes, the oven door was broken by the time I got there. And we, for that, because it was a holiday weekend, I got permission from the property manager, and we gave them the keys to the model, which happened to be one building over, and they used the oven in there to cook their Thanksgiving dinner. They did end up having to pay for the replacement stove, but I let the office handle that. In the case of what we're talking about today, I wasn't going to give Miss Evelyn another stove or that. I actually was going to calibrate hers. So the very first thing I asked her was, how long do you let the oven preheat? And that case or that letting the oven preheat is a critical thing, because the stove said 10 minutes. She told me she let it preheat for 20 to 25 minutes. I did some checking, and when your oven or stove, when you set it to preheat, oftentimes newer ones, they give you a ding or a beep or a buzz to let you know when they're preheated. Do yourself a favor, and before you put your food in there, let it go a little bit longer. Because the longer you preheat, the more stable the temperature is going to be. Now, for Miss Evelyn, in order to calibrate it, all you do, and all I did, is you take a thermometer. Now, an analog thermometer, one of the ones that you can go buy for $5 or $6. It's a little dial one that you may see sitting on a rack or on inside of an oven. It's got the analog needle that points around. They're okay. You can use them, but they're not exactly known to be as accurate as what someone like Miss Evelyn is going to look for. So what you instead should do is get a digital one with a remote probe. You can use one that has a type K connector on many meters. And what you do is you take this probe and you put it in the very middle of the oven. Move the rack if you need to, put it in the middle of the oven, and then turn the burner to a temperature. Doesn't really matter which temperature you pick, just pick one. My preference is, and especially with Miss Evelyn, I turned it to 300 degrees. Close the door and let it preheat. Don't pay attention to it, just let it preheat, let it go. And then what you do, and this is the same regardless of what brand you're using, Electrolux, GE, Whirlpool, even the more expensive ones, Sub-Zero, Viking, whatever brand name oven you're using, set it to a temperature. I use 300 just because I like round numbers. Then what you do is you let it preheat. And after it's preheated, begin to pay attention to what the temperature is showing you. In other words, you will see that the temperature goes above 300 degrees and then it drops down below 300 degrees. And what you need to do is write down, in my case for Miss Evelyn, I used my little notepad. You may use your cell phone, or I've even seen somebody take pictures of the thermostat. That way you don't have to remember it. You just take pictures of your cell phone. What you do is you write down the 3 highest temperatures and the 3 lowest temperatures. Then you take an average. Remember, this is a clean, preheated oven. Then you pay attention to those temperatures. And the average should be within 10 degrees of your set point. Meaning, I set it at 300. The temperature should be between 305, the average, between 305 and down below to 295. In my case where Miss Evelyn was concerned, I actually got an average of 372 degrees. Yeah, that's slightly out of calibration and tells us why she ended up with charcoal sitting on her counter when she was finished. Her stove, her oven was way out of calibration. In this case, all I had to do was replace the thermostat for the oven, and then I double checked the calibration, and the new one was the average was right dead on. And that was the beginning of a fantastic relationship and the need for new uniforms at that property, because getting to know Miss Evelyn, she began bringing fresh bread to the office one day every week. And sourdough and rye and French and baguettes and all of the wonderful breads. Oh, the pull apart monkey bread that she made, to this day, my mouth still waters remembering it. So our lesson today, first of all, be nice to all of your residents, every one of them. Oh, by the way, the office never, ever got beyond calling. Every time she walked into that office, she would start over with, "Hi, it's a bitch again." And it kind of became a joke. She was a really, really sweet lady. But to me, she'll always be Miss Evelyn, the bread lady. A really, really neat resident. Begin to pay attention to how things are supposed to work, particularly when we look at appliances. I hope you've enjoyed the story today. Have a fantastic rest of the week, and I'll see you somewhere.
Thank you again to AppWork for sponsoring today's episode. Imagine carrying a digital make-ready board in your pocket with work order tracking and maintenance technician leaderboards designed to gamify the process and bring out your team's competitive best. AppWork offers solutions to headaches that have plagued the multifamily industry for decades. Visit www.appworkco.com today.